Okay, wonderful. Welcome. My name is Regina Celestin Williams, and I'm the Executive Director of SV at Home.
Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Regina, and I'm so sorry, Regina, I didn't catch your whole name. Mi nombre es Regina y yo soy la directora ejecutiva de SV at Home.
Welcome to our deep dive series, where our goal is to provide a deeper understanding of housing topics to those of us in the housing space, advocating for change and working to dismantle oppressive systems of injustice.
Y bienvenidos a todos. Esta es una serie donde nos vamos a profundizar sobre vivienda y nuestra meta es tener un entendimiento más profundo sobre temas de vivienda para los que nosotros que estamos abogando en este espacio para desmantelar los sistemas opresivos de injusticia. Hoy vamos a platicar más sobre las finanzas de vivienda asequible.
Today, we'll be talking about affordable housing finance. And before we get started, we do have Spanish interpretation today, and I'd like to introduce our interpreter, Michelle Tepete. Michelle, can you please let folks know how to find you?
Y entonces, antes de que empecemos esta conversación sobre vivienda asequible y las finanzas detrás de ese tema, vamos a presentar a Michelle. Yo soy Michelle, nuestra intérprete. Y por favor, Michelle, si nos puedes dar una presentación breve sobre las instrucciones de la interpretación. Entonces, buenas tardes a todos. Mi nombre es Michelle Topete, yo soy la intérprete para hoy. Desde hoy en adelante voy a estar en el canal de español y para que ustedes puedan tener acceso a la interpretación en su idioma de inglés a español, o perdón, de inglés, sí, es inglés a español. Abajo van a ver en un momentito, todavía no está prendido, pero en un momentito van a ver lo que es un globo, un icono de un globo en la parte inferior derecha de su pantalla. En en cuanto se prendan la interpretación, ustedes pueden tener acceso al hacerle clic al globo y después van a escoger su idioma.
Okay, wonderful. Um, so before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the indigenous peoples of the Muwekma Ohlone, Ramaytush Ohlone, Tamian Nation, and Amut Mutsun on which we are learning, working, and organizing today. We are committed to honoring and making visible the indigenous people and tribes that were intentionally displaced from their land, who remain here in Silicon Valley and are a part of our community. Now I'm going to hand it over to Allison Singalani, our policy manager, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Regina. So I know many of you are familiar with SV at Home, but for anyone who is not, SV at Home is a nonprofit organization that advocates for bold systemic change to meet the housing needs of Santa Clara County's very diverse residents. So we engage early technical knowledge to win broad-based community support for evidence-based solutions. So we know that we need different strategies and approaches to address different housing needs, including producing new affordable housing, preserving existing affordable housing, and protecting our community's most vulnerable residents from displacement. We prioritize community education and building up our area's pro-housing organizations and emerging leaders, because we believe that growing the capacity to raise our voices together creates opportunities for engagement and impact. So welcome, really looking forward to a great conversation with you today. So a little bit about our goals today and what we're trying to accomplish. We want to talk about what we mean when we talk about affordable housing, how we make housing affordable and self-sustaining. I want to talk a little bit about what you may have heard about as the funding stack. So those layers of financing and the importance of local funding. We'll talk a little bit about tax credits, which you may know as LIHTC, and the role of private investment in building affordable housing. And then we'll talk about state streamlining and cost reduction and the success of Santa Clara County's Measure A and next steps to continue to move forward. So let's jump right in. What do we mean when we talk about affordable housing or creating affordable housing? We often think about that as building more deed-restricted affordable homes, and deed-restricted means that homes can only be rented to people with incomes in a certain range. And of course, that's hugely important. So building new 100% affordable developments is the focus of our conversation today, but we also want to acknowledge that there are more ways that we create affordable housing. So another way is to build more new affordable homes by integrating them in new market rate developments. And that's known as inclusionary housing. They're in the green bubble. We'll come back to talk about that a little more in a few minutes. Creating more affordable homes also means preserving affordability in the homes that we already have. So there are two kinds of housing preservation. So the first is extending the affordability of existing affordable housing. So almost all affordable housing built in California now will be deed restricted to remain affordable for at least 55 years. In the past, the length of affordability for some sources of funding has been shorter than 55 years, 20 years or 30 years. So by the end of the period of deed restriction, these homes often need remodeling to remain useful and habitable for the quality of life to be there. So while a for-profit developer may convert the homes to market rate, a mission-driven nonprofit developer will generally work to access funding to rehabilitate the homes and to extend the length of time that this housing remains affordable. Sometimes a nonprofit developer will purchase a development where the affordability is expiring and the homes are at risk of converting to market rate, and then rehabilitate them. So you may know this as, you may have heard the phrase AC rehab or acquisition and rehab. But most low-income families, the vast majority of low-income families, live in homes that are not subsidized or deed restricted. So these homes can be subject to rent increases. They can be remodeled and rented at higher cost or demolished and redeveloped. So the tenants living in these homes often face a lot of uncertainty and risk. When nonprofit organizations, such as community-based developers or community land trusts, purchase these properties and place deed restrictions on the units to limit the rents to affordable rates and protect tenants, that's also known as affordable housing preservation. So preservation is a super important tool to protect residents from displacement, and also to really be a source of community empowerment through community land trusts, community development corporations, and co-op housing models. So this is a really brief overview of housing preservation. We're looking forward to a deep dive on this topic in spring of 2025. So just acknowledging there's more coming on this. So let's return to what we mean when we talk about affordable housing, because that can be really confusing for the public. Many of us are not sure how to describe affordable housing, or maybe we've tried to answer that question and see people's eyes glaze over as we start talking in technical terms about area median income or deed restrictions. So in fact, research shows that the public is deeply concerned about homelessness and housing affordability, but they're confused about what we mean when we talk about affordable housing. They're not seeing a connection between building more housing and addressing homelessness or housing affordability. And that can undermine public support for the resources and the homes that we need. So it's clear that we need to find a more helpful way to think about and explain what affordable housing is. So on the next few slides, I'll share some simple definitions of affordable housing that help meet this need for understanding and can empower us with tools and better ways to talk about affordable housing when we're talking to other people in the community. So first, affordable housing is an asset that sustains and strengthens our communities by ensuring that we all have access to a safe, stable home. Affordable housing provides a range of housing solutions that each address the diverse needs of local residents who cannot afford the cost of housing in Silicon Valley. We'll make sure we share these slides with you after the presentation as well, so you have access to these definitions as well. Also, affordable housing is the public's answer to addressing the needs of people who've been harmed by our housing market. It's a bridge between our current inequitable system and a place where everyone in our community can thrive. So what are we talking about when we say affordable or low income housing? So this gets into that little bit more technical definition, probably not where you want to start a conversation, but it may be helpful for us to understand when we're talking about affordable housing finance, since those sources are often tailored to address specific needs in the community. So income level categories are determined by both the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, known as HUD, and the California Department of Housing and Community Development, known as HCD. They're adjusted to account for the median income in different areas of the country. Santa Clara County has one of the highest area median incomes in the country and the state at more than $184,000 for a family of 4 in 2024. I also want to note that that's an increase of $30,000 from the median income here in 2021. We know that there's a lot of need that falls well below that level. In Santa Clara County, our local jurisdictions are accountable for permitting about 130,000 new homes over the next roughly 7 or 8 years. About half of that, about 60, 65, 70,000 of those homes need to be deed restricted for lower income households. So affordable housing is not one size fits all. It provides a wide range of solutions to meet a wide range of people's needs. So all of the types of affordable homes that you see here are deed restricted. So that means they can't change to market rate rents for at least 55 years. I should have mentioned earlier, but just as we go along, if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation. Thank you. So even if a lower income renter moves out, these deed restrictions mean that the homes are going to continue to serve the community, providing affordable housing to individuals and families here in Santa Clara County for decades to come. So great investment. Often multiple populations are served in a single development. So for instance, you may see housing for seniors combined with housing for folks who are aging out of the foster care system but still need a place to land. You may see housing for families of different income levels combined with housing for survivors of domestic violence or tailored for veterans. You'll also note we have housing for missing middle and low and moderate income folks. We'll talk a little bit more about a tool for that on the next slide here. We'll also see permanent supportive housing and housing for adults with developmental disabilities or for seniors. These are all important populations that may need a little bit of extra help or a lot of extra help and making sure that they have housing stability. So let's talk for a moment about our current housing market. We understand it's broken from top to bottom. We have tens of thousands of folks who are paying more than half their income on rent. They're hardworking people or people on fixed incomes that are devastated by the high cost of housing. We also have low and moderate income families and individuals who are just priced out and paying too much to be secure and stay in the communities that they call home. It may not be half their income, but tens of thousands more are rent burdened. They're lacking housing security. They're not being served by our current housing market. Inclusionary housing, or integrating some units of affordable housing into new market rate housing developments, is a critical tool to meet the needs of these residents. A lot of our local jurisdictions have inclusionary ordinances, which are regulations that require market rate developers to include a percentage of homes affordable to low or moderate income households. It's important to note that inclusionary cannot support more deeply affordable rents at extremely low incomes or very low incomes without making that market rate development infeasible. So we don't want to push that far. But inclusionary ordinances are important because this is one of the only tools that we have to meet the needs of lower middle income folks people who can't afford market rate rents but need a little bit of extra help. By including that affordable housing in a market rate development, inclusionary housing policies also promote mixed income developments that can reflect the diversity of our community, as well as meeting the needs of those middle income families. So let's talk now about 100% affordable housing developments. Like residents in market rate housing, families who live in affordable housing pay rent, but the rents they can afford to pay are often too low to cover the full costs of building, making monthly loan payments, and ongoing management for a rental property. So here's our problem, or our challenge. The total cost of development and monthly operations is about $3,600 per month per unit in our example here. We have a family over here that can afford to pay $1,800. That's not enough to cover the costs. We need to figure out how to fill that gap. So the gap between the amount of money it takes to develop and operate a rental property and the rent revenue needs to be filled for an affordable housing development to be completed successfully. To fill the gap, developers usually need help in the form of a subsidy. How is affordable housing financed to be self-sustaining? A lot of people don't realize that it is. Public funding usually helps cover the costs of development, from architects and engineers to construction. Since the developer is borrowing less money, they have less money to pay back each month. That reduces the monthly cost of operating the development so that the lower rents are able to cover the lower operating costs, making the development sustainable in the long term. So back to our original illustration, the gap is closed by subsidies, money that most often comes from the federal, state, and or local government, but it can also come from some other sources we'll discuss. The subsidy is used to help cover the construction costs, and assistance with the construction costs reduces the amount of money the developer needs to borrow, and that reduces the monthly operating costs of development. So effectively, we have moved the cost of that development down to where our family can afford it on the rent that they can afford to pay, and that's enough to cover the monthly operating costs of the development. Depending on the specifics of a project, it may need multiple kinds of assistance. Developers have to assemble many sources of funding to help fill that affordable housing funding gap. They usually try to use the fewest number of subsidy sources possible because each additional source of subsidy makes the funding more complex. For example, each subsidy is going to come with its own set of legal restrictions. To reach the lowest income families with the greatest needs, a developer might need to cobble together multiple subsidy sources to make the project financially feasible. And again, a project is not feasible unless it can close 100% of that funding gap, so every source matters. The low-income housing tax credit, which you may know as LIHTC, is the most common and generally the largest source of subsidy. Developers will also need a commercial bank loan, just like you or I would, that covers a portion of the costs. Loan underwriters must consider the property's cash flow when deciding how much to loan. So if the units are being offered to families with lower income levels at lower rents, the developer will often receive less money in that loan. You'll see other federal and state sources listed here, and we'll get into a little bit more of that in a moment. But I want to draw your attention to the local government loan and the county and regional bond measure pieces. It's just a couple of pieces of the puzzle, but they're really important ones because without them, there's often a gap remaining that the developer can't bridge. And that means the development and those affordable homes that we need can't move forward. So what are some of the funding sources for 100% affordable housing? You'll see here, we mentioned a sample financing stack. So this is kind of a little bit of a simplified example of what that can look like. It's going to include private sources, local sources. We have the potential for regional sources. We'll talk a little bit about that and a little bit later. In our sample stack, we don't have them there because right now we don't have much in the way of regional sources of funding, but we have the potential for that in the future. We have a collection of state sources. Many of these are smaller sources, but they can, again, make a big difference. We also have federal sources. You'll see these broken up into a couple of areas. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, or LIHTC program, is a federal source that's administered by the state. We also have project-based Section 8 that I'll talk a little more about in a moment, that is administered by the local county housing authority. And we have the community block development grants, home, and some other small programs that are administered by our local jurisdictions or cities. So let's just take a moment to talk about those vouchers. So some households, you'll see those circled over here, some households have very little or no income. They could be coming from being unhoused and unemployed, on a fixed income, or with incomes well below the $55,000 that qualifies as extremely low income. Project-based Section 8 vouchers can provide an important extra infusion to make the project work. They're a federally funded source that's administered by the local housing authority in partnership with the developer. You may have heard about Section 8 vouchers as a program used to subsidize rents in the private market, where a resident takes the voucher and uses it to help pay market rate rents. Project-based Section 8 comes from the same pool of vouchers at the housing authority, but they stay connected to the project rather than move with the tenant. So that allows the development to consistently continue to meet the needs of lowest income tenants over time. We also have local funding that we mentioned. Local funding is critical because it can leverage 3 to 5 times as much money in state and federal funds. So for every local dollar we put in, we get $3 to $5 that would otherwise flow to other communities that are able to help leverage and provide some local funding. So this is where it gets really important. So some of the common sources that we see are commercial linkage fees, and those charge developers of non-residential buildings a fee that can help fund affordable housing based on the number of low-wage jobs that we anticipate that building type creates. We have in lieu fees that are often an option for developers instead of building inclusionary units. They can pay a fee instead, which then gives the city flexible funding for more affordable housing. There's also some miscellaneous smaller pools and some innovative sources like general obligation bonds, including Santa Clara County's Measure A that we'll talk about a little bit later. A real estate transfer tax that provides a portion of funding from high dollar real estate transactions, usually commercial. An employee head tax, which we haven't seen yet in the county. We've had a lot of false starts on that front. Or discounted public and city-owned land or land dedication. All right, so thanks for bearing with me. I know that's a lot of information. I'm going to pass it over to Regina now to talk with us about the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, or LIHTC.
Thank you, Allison. So I'm going to chat with you all a little bit about the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. And the reason why we spend a good amount of time talking specifically about this program is because it really does fund the majority of housing, affordable housing in the country. And so it's a really critical program that sort of creates a lot of the boundaries within which we see housing is, affordable housing is built. And so hopefully by sharing a little bit of detail about like what, how this program operates, what the motivations are of the folks involved in the program, we can understand some of the boundaries that sort of exist in how we build affordable housing, and maybe get to some of the questions like the one that Susan asked about, like, what keeps us from building this kind of housing, or why do we see a majority of housing built this way? So I'm hopeful that we can kind of see how it's done and then think a little bit broader as well about how we can be innovative in addressing our housing crisis. So the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program really is a public-private partnership. It really did, when it was created in 1986, create this program that was a privatization of the production of affordable housing, which we all know is a public good. We see that we need more affordable housing and everyone should have a home, and housing is a human right. And so with the creation through the Internal Revenue Code of this tax program, this is the federal government incentivizing the private corporations to get involved in producing this public good that we call affordable housing. And actually, between 13,000 and 23,000 homes are built annually in California through this program. So as we think about, RHNA targets, as we think about goals for building more housing and how we can really get to scale at addressing the housing that we need, a lot of folks in the affordable housing space turn to this program and think about how we can leverage this program that's able to create housing at scale because of this tax incentive. And so again, this is a public-private partnership. The federal government, through the IRS, has an allocation of tax credits that is made to each state through the most competitive program, the 9% program. And we'll talk more about that. And an allocation of tax credits is given to, in California, what's called the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. And they're able to determine which projects get awarded credits, and they're responsible for regulating and monitoring the awards. The California Debt Limit Allocation Committee exists to monitor and allocate, award tax-exempt bond authority. And with that, it's able to also work with the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee to provide what they call by right tax credits to projects that meet the 50% test for the bond allocation, the bond awards that are made through the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee. And we'll talk more about this, but essentially we have these public entities like the federal government, which is not HUD, not some sort of granting program, but the IRS, which is a program that really is there for regulation and monitoring, working with state allocating committees that are also in place to select projects to award these credits and regulate. And then we have the private sector. We have developers, investors, attorneys, many different sectors of the business community that are looking to work within this tax credit program to be able to utilize this program to build affordable housing throughout our country and throughout our state. And the private role really is to, do all of the real estate development activity, identify the sites, I build the housing, work with local jurisdictions to identify the need and make sure that the projects that they're looking to build will get funded through this program, and that the projects that are being developed and the communities that are being created will be in line with the program requirements. So they're managing all of the rules that exist for the program, along with managing the risk that comes along with real estate development and building housing, and what it takes to make sure that all of the players involved, whether it's the public agencies or the funders and the banks and the investors, are all in line and satisfied and receiving profit and also in compliance. So what, let me take a step back and talk a little bit about how the program was created, the low-income housing tax credit. There are three benefits to owning real estate. There are tax benefits. That means, for those of us who own a, a, a rental property, there are the tax benefits of being able to have tax write-offs. That means the depreciation of the value of the property over time. On your annual taxes, you're able to write off as a deferral. There are what's called tax credits. You may better know, unless you're involved in real estate, rental real estate activity, better understand tax credits. When we file our taxes, there's tax credits for, our children or our dependents, things that are dollar for dollar deductions in your tax liability. Those are benefits to owning rental real estate. There's also the annual cash flow that comes from owning rental real estate. So if you have a rental property and the revenue is greater than the operating costs, then that's cash flow. And that's another financial benefit. And then there's also appreciation. So if you sell your property at the end of a holding period, whether it's 5 years or 15 years, there's an ability to sell it for greater than any what you paid when you bought it, and that's recognized as appreciation. So all of those attributes of rental real estate exist in the production of affordable housing. And what the low-income housing tax credit program does is understanding that if you're providing housing where the rental revenue is reduced, the opportunity for cash flow is reduced, and thus the opportunity for appreciation is reduced, because typically the valuation is based on cash flow. Then what the federal government did was create a tax credit and said that we can incentivize private actors, corporations, to produce affordable housing by writing into the tax code that they get a tax credit if they do so. And that way, the return that the private company and corporation are receiving for building this housing in the real estate market, the return comes from the tax credits. It comes from tax benefits. It doesn't come from cash flow. There's not a motivation to have high rents that are much greater than operating expenses. There's not a motivation to have a property that is valued significantly higher at the end of a holding period. It really is all about the tax credits that the corporation receives over time. And so what that means is we have a program that is really reliant on a few different actors that may not be typically found in, the typical real estate development. Actors like what we call syndicators, which are brokers of the tax credits. They match the projects with corporations looking for tax credits, corporations that may have lots of income, income that they're looking to shelter with tax credits so that they don't have to have as much taxes that they pay to the federal government. Those syndicators broker deals to bring affordable housing developers to those corporations. There's also banks that are involved in doing direct investments into low-income housing tax credit projects. There's lots of different actors that support the investors, like accountants that specialize in tax credits and making sure that the accounting each year is all in line so that they can receive those tax credits when they file their tax filings to the federal government and the IRS. There's lots of lawyers that have studied and do work around this particular program to ensure that that the projects are eligible for the tax benefits that come through this program, this section of the IRS code. And then, of course, there are folks who specialize in compliance, making sure that the affordable housing that's created through these programs doesn't violate any of the requirements to receive the tax credits from the IRS. So there's a lot of structure in place to make sure that there is compliance and that the benefits from the federal government through the IRS continue to flow to the investors. So if we think about, the role of the developer in receiving these tax credits and being able to build housing with these tax credits. Again, this is a funding mechanism, but the developers themselves, this isn't cash, it's not a grant. They have to actually go through a process of receiving a tax credit allocation and being able to receive cash at some point to pay to build the housing. And so these steps are really about, like, first you apply, the tax credit programs are competitive, especially in the state of California. And so you have certain criteria that you design your community that you're building, your affordable housing community, to meet, and you apply to one of the allocating committees under their criteria for receiving the tax credits. Then you receive an award saying that your application scored well amongst the other applications, and you will receive a credit of so much based on the eligible project costs. And then now you have to actually take that award of tax credits that you will receive if you build the housing and go into a tax credit market, and talk to investors, talk to syndicators about what they would pay you to get actual cash, actual equity. You have to talk to them about what they would pay you for this particular project that comes with this particular allocation of tax credits. So, some investors may have different profit margins that they have to meet, different return requirements. They may assess risk in different ways, and that will affect their tax credit pricing. And so you have a certain amount of time to sort of shop around and talk to different investors about what they would provide in terms of the actual cash, the actual equity. And then in return, that investor will receive the tax credits over a period of 10 years. So they're also discounting for the fact that they have to pay you upfront to build the housing for essentially financial benefit that they will receive over time. So you're not going to get $1 of cash for $1 of tax credits, because they're receiving the money over time, and they're giving you the money upfront to pay to build the actual affordable housing community. They want to see all of the other funding that is going to go into the capital stack, the funding that Allison went over with you earlier, secured before you're even awarded the tax credit allocation. So because of the structure of the high competition, the high demand for tax credits, and also the structure that really incentivizing minimizing risk, there's a need to assemble all of your other funding before you even get an award of tax credits, and have those and really start having those serious conversations with investors about building that community. So, okay, I've been sort of talking in general about the low-income housing tax credit, and I'm sure many of you have heard that there are two low-income housing tax credit programs. There is the 9% tax credit program, which is highly competitive. There is a cap of how many 9% tax credits are awarded to every state. And they provide a higher amount, a higher rate of equity, a higher rate of tax credits based on the cost of your project. And so they tend to fund a higher portion of the project cost, the total project cost. The 4% tax credit program is also competitive in the state of California. It's become highly competitive since around 2020, when the state really started ramping up the amount of affordable housing it was looking to build to address the high cost of living and the need for more affordable housing. This particular program has become quite the bottleneck in the state of California for addressing our housing crisis, because while it is awarded by right or automatically when you receive tax-exempt private activity bonds from the state, there is a bond cap for every state. So again, both programs are competitive. The 9% tax credits you receive, and you use like traditional conventional financing, and the 9% tax credits. The 4% tax credits you receive automatically when you apply to the California Debt Limit Allocation Committee for the tax-exempt bonds, but that also has a cap. So both of these programs are extremely competitive. So a little bit more about how the tax credits, the 4% tax credit work with the 4% bond. The developer applies to CDLAC for the bond cap authority. The application for tax-exempt bonds is capped because tax-exempt bonds is a type of debt financing that doesn't require the lender to pay taxes on the profits that it makes. So the interest that the lender would charge in those profits, it doesn't have to pay taxes. And so it's actually discounted debt. So there is a tax-exempt bond program here in the state of California that allows you to access for public benefit tax-exempt bonds from the state that will lower your interest that you are charged for that debt, allowing you to borrow more for those public benefit activities like building affordable housing. And when you do that and you pay at least 50% of your total project costs with a tax-exempt bond, you automatically get 4% tax credits when you're building affordable housing. And so there might be a little bit of confusion about these 4% tax credits being unlimited and being less competitive. But really, in the state of California, as I said before, it is very competitive to get access to them, because you have to, if your project is $100 million, you have to borrow more than 50%, so more than $50 million in tax-exempt bond, using up that bond cap authority to even access the tax credits. So that is what some of us refer to as the 50% bond test. And so yes, you still work with a private lender to borrow that money, a public entity to issue that bond, and the project pays the bond back as the developer receives the 4% tax credits to pay some more, cover some more of the costs of building the project. So as we sort of have worked through some of these more complex concepts, I think it would be interesting to kind of look at example with some numbers to translate some of the topics that I've covered. When you're looking to calculate how much tax credits your particular community that is being built is eligible for, it's actually based on the cost of the development. So, and what's called eligible basis costs. So most costs are eligible. The typical cost that you will see that is ineligible for basis is the cost of the land. So in this example of this case study that we're sharing with you today, you can see $5 million deducted from the total development cost, and that represents the cost of the land. So once you have your eligible basis, you multiply that basis by the credit rate. In this particular example, we're using the 4% credit rate. So this is a 4% tax credit project. And so you can also kind of understand the difference between 4% and 9% is that if you're calculating based on 4% of this $92 million cost basis, you end up with an annual tax credit amount of 3.7 million. The investor will receive 3.7 million over 10 years. So each year they get 3.7 million. So that ends up being a total of 37 million in tax credits that investor would receive. And so what you're doing is talking to investors, if you're the developer, about how much they would pay per tax credit. In this example, we show 90 cents because, again, they're receiving it over time. And so that investor is agreeing to pay $33.4 million for $37 million of tax credit. So I hope this example helps folks kind of understand a little bit better some of the concepts that I've been talking through. So some of the criteria used to score the tax credit developments is population served. A lot of those populations that Allison went over earlier, like family developments, communities that are built for seniors, communities built for folks who have experienced homelessness or are deemed as chronically homeless. Folks who are exiting the foster care system, young people, like there are different populations that are scored according to different values or prioritized for a certain amount of the tax credit allocation. There's also scoring around higher highest resource area categorization, housing that would be built in areas that have high amounts of resources according to the state. There is scoring around experience in terms of being a developer or a general partner, the experience of the management company, again, things to mitigate risk. And then there is a tiebreaker. Typically, for both programs, you're looking to score a perfect score or very close to a perfect score in order to access these tax credits because it's so competitive. And so it really does come down to the tiebreaker, which is around committed permanent soft financing, and also any bonuses that are tied to building family housing in highest resource areas. There are other site amenities that are scored, like adjacency to transit, parks, libraries, access to grocery stores and schools, clinics, senior centers, pharmacies, all thinking about, what best services the population that is served, what the needs may be for that population, and what it's important for them to have access to. And so again, most of these communities are really looking to score a perfect score, which means they're looking to be located next to a number of these amenities. In this particular case study, we wanted to also make sure that we sort of shared how the ownership structure works. And so for Summer Oak Village, you have the developer and the investor. The actual Summer Oak Village Apartments is owned by an entity called the Limited Partnership, the Summer Oak Village Limited Partnership. And in this diagram, you can see how both the developer and the investor partner within that limited partnership to make decisions, as well as to bring in the investor, which here is represented by a bank fund, so that that investor receives all of the benefits of owning the real estate, which is essentially the tax benefits. So what we see in tax credit partnerships is an ownership that's split between the managing general partner, the developer making the decisions, a minimal ownership of 0.01%, and the investor who is sort of like a higher level investor, they're able to make certain decisions at a very, very high level. They're not doing all of the work of on the ground. They own 99.99% of the partnership, and that is, again, so that all of the tax credits flow to them because they will be contributing in this case, $33 million to fund the project. And in turn, they need to receive all of the $37 million of tax credits. And this is an IRS requirement. So we also wanted to share in this example a unit mix of a typical project. In this particular community, we have 116 units of housing. One unit that's unrestricted, that means it doesn't have a requirement to keep the rent restricted because the manager lives there. Sometimes we'll see the manager units be for free to those managers, but they don't have to qualify as low income to live there. And then we have 115 units that's broken up in 1 and 2 and 3 bedroom types, the majority of which are 1 bedrooms, and a certain percentage of each, 30% of each of those bedroom types are for extremely low income households. And that is to address the fact that we have this property is serving folks who may have been chronically homeless. And so those particular units have Section 8 attached to them, project-based Section 8, to supplement the rent that those households can pay. So they're only paying 1/3 of their income, no matter what that income is, to help stabilize them in the housing. And then there are some units at 50% of area median income, and then a few units at 60% of median area median income. So we can see that this really is a mixed income community. And then we wanted to just give a little bit more detail about what the mix of sources might look like for a project like the Summer Oak Village apartments. So in this case, we have the tax exempt bond, which again, with this limited amount of rental revenue coming from the affordable housing, the loan is a little bit larger because it is tax exempt and has a lower interest rate compared to the market. And then we also have a Federal Home Loan Bank loan, which lenders who participate in the Federal Home Loan Bank are able to access those funds through the affordable housing program there. Then we can see that 30% of the sources is made up of government funds. So funds from the city of San Jose that they may have available for affordable housing, funds from the Santa Clara County, Measure A, the Measure A bond that was issued, that was passed back in 2016, provided funds for this particular project. Then we layer state funding. So programs like the No Place Like Home program, which primarily supports permanent supportive housing, because we have a portion of the units that are dedicated to serving households that were formerly unhoused. We're able to leverage 4.8 million of those sources from the state. And then the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities source from the Housing and Community Development Department is leveraged because of the adjacency to transit or some other commitment to reducing greenhouse gases made by this particular project. And then we can see that 35%, the largest portion compared to any of these other sources of funding, is the low-income tax credit equity. And that's at 90 cents on the dollar from the equity investor, so that we get to the total sources. And there's a small amount of deferred fee from the developer. A lot of times there's a need to fill a small gap depending on, how, the developer's been trying to line up all of these sources to exactly match the cost. And so if there's a little bit of misalignment, they'll defer some of the fee that they earn to make sure that everything lines up and the sources match the costs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew Reed, our Director of Policy, to talk a little bit more about value, progress, and next steps.
Great, wonderful. Thank you, Regina. That was a lot. We're going to share slides, but we always get those questions about how this actually works. So we're going to step a little bit back up to a higher level and just take this one head on. Housing is expensive to build in the Bay Area. There are high costs for land, labor, materials, and we know right now the costs of borrowing money are very high. Affordable housing is more expensive than market rate housing, but in some ways that's because it's a slightly different product. So affordable housing delivers and requires higher wages for the workers, generally produces larger units for families than the private market produces. The development standards are generally higher, and we get public benefit of outcomes. We get better health, education, employment outcomes. We lower domestic and community violence. We also know that permanent affordable housing is the most cost-effective way to address the needs of people who are unhoused in a sustainable way. So yes, we're paying slightly more than we do for market rate housing, but we get a really different product. Next slide. And I want to talk a little bit about what we've been doing at a statewide level that is having an impact on improving the process locally and reducing costs In this case, very important to realize that time is money, and that the process that a city goes through to approve an affordable project can have a big impact on how long it takes and subsequently how much it costs. So beginning in 2017, some of you may be familiar, the state legislature really stepped in, has always been involved, but really stepped in to make sure the local processes were efficient. So SB 35, which passed in 2017 and was updated just last year, allows for affordable projects to move forward by right, which means as long as they meet the objective standards in the city and for that location, they have to be approved by the department and don't have to go to the city council for approval. They are also exempt from the requirements of the California Environmental Quality Act review process. The assumption is that the analysis the city has done at a city level addresses the big issues and that this streamlines the costs and the time involved in building affordable housing. And newly, we're using that leverage to make sure that we are targeting the resources where they're needed most with extremely low income households. So that's an effort to make things go faster and more efficient. Next slide. The state has also updated a long-standing program called the State Density Bonus Program, which is really focused on building more homes and providing cost savings for the development. So for 100% affordable projects, you can increase up to 80% additional number of units than the underlying zoning allows. So it really allows us to build better, higher with more units by using this state law. There are also significant cost savings connected to the state density bonus. You are entitled legally to concessions that will reduce costs. It could be changing the lot setbacks. It could be lowering the minimum unit size so that you can put more units into one place. You also, as a developer, are entitled to waivers, which are intended to remove barriers to development at these new densities that you're allowed. So it could be taller buildings. There's a focus on maximum parking requirements, make sure there's space to build those units and the costs come down. Next slide. All of this is to say that at the state level, they're recognizing we need to create efficiencies and lower costs. And this is related to how we finance this stuff because it has a big impact on how much money we need per unit to build it. So SB 330 was another law that was passed to try and make sure that the approval process was faster and that there was predictability in the fees and the development standards. So we created some timelines for expedited permitting at the city level to make sure that we knew things were moving forward, and also locked in the zoning standards and fees. Sometimes the rules would change out from underneath you in the middle of your process and cause huge problems and delays. And this said, no, once the application comes in, we're going to sort of establish the rules of the game, and that has a big impact on predictability for the developer going forward. Again, lowering costs, making things more efficient. So the state has stepped in places where the local government has struggled, and that's a big part of how this financing ends up working because we're creating efficiencies to address some of those additional costs that are incurred through 100% affordable housing developments. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about the success we've had with local money. There are some programs in some of the cities. Allison talked a little bit about different sources. We have a dedicated source in San Jose that was intended to build affordable housing and now is being used for a mix of different responses to the housing crisis, including interim housing for folks that are homeless. But the big the big effort that we had in Santa Clara County was an affordable housing bond that was passed in 2016. It required a 2/3 vote to pass, and we just squeaked by with 67.8% of the vote. And the bond was $950 million bond. We were hoping to produce roughly 5,350 new homes, and it was supposed to be about 10 years. So we were supposed to figure out how to be efficient enough to spend this money roughly by 2027. So the status as of this year is that we're way ahead of schedule. We have committed, over $800 million already. That commitment covers well over 5,000 new homes. We're going to probably blow through the goals that we had in total. Importantly, this has already set the stage or begun to leverage $3.9 billion. Remember, $950 million bond, leveraging an additional $3.9 billion of state, local, and private resources. That's a ratio of 4-to-1. We've already done 56 projects in 10 cities. Measure A has been a tremendous success, and it really highlights what we can do when we have the resources to work with. Next slide. What's happened, though, which is great, is that our system is working. And you can see it's working all around the region. But we have a significant number of developments in Santa Clara County that promise a tremendous number of new affordable homes. And as you saw, we're getting very close to spending down that countywide money. And so because we've gotten good at this, our success has led to a need for replacing those local dollars. Next slide. Actually, go back. As many of you know, and we're actively involved in supporting and advocating and beginning the organizing, we were looking at a regional 9-county bond, which was going to be sponsored by the regional entity, the Bay Area Housing Finance Agency. And I think it was 2 weeks ago today that measure was pulled from the ballot. So we are going to have to, and we know the problem exists, and we know that we have the will and the capacity to find ways of generating this money, but we're going to have to go back and figure out how to do it, because that regional measure is not going to be on the ballot this year. So this will happen. It's just going to be on a different schedule, and we're working through how to approach it. Next slide. A critical piece, though, that is on the ballot is called Proposition 5. And it is focused on removing barriers to local and regional affordable housing bonds. Really what this will do, and we'll talk about the details, is it'll re-empower us as local communities to respond to what we know are local needs. It could be regional needs. But this will really give us the tool that we need to take that next step and figure out how to generate those resources. Today, just 1/3 of the voters in any jurisdiction can prevent the success of a local or regional bond, because we have to get 66%, 2/3 of the vote. We got it with Measure E, but it was with Measure A, excuse me, but it was a huge stretch, and it's much more difficult now. So what Prop 5 would be to amend the state constitution to set the voter approval threshold for affordable housing bonds and some other infrastructure bonds at a 55% majority rather than a 2/3. This is the same as school bonds, and it will provide us a way forward as we figure out how to respond to the funding needs that we have. This is really an opportunity to empower us with a critical tool to take this next step. It's not going to end our challenge, but this is an opportunity to remove some of the barriers that we have as we go forward to generate that local money. Next slide. Go back one more. Those of you who are on this now will be receiving more information about this from us and possibly from some other sources. But we really are going to be asking folks to spread the word about Prop 5 and make sure that you have an opportunity to plug in to some of the work that's going to be done knocking on doors and making phone calls to make sure we can get this one across the finish line. That is the end of our presentation today. We have some time for questions. We're a couple of minutes over where we had hoped to be. But I'm going to turn it back over to Allison, who I think has been collecting them from the chat.
Awesome. Thanks so much, with help from our team. So I have a few questions. So thank you so much, Regina and Matthew, for that awesome presentation. I'm going to take a quick to answer question yet, and then we'll get into some that might have a little bit more discussion. So I had a question: can projects in small cities and rural areas compete successfully for tax credits? The answer is yes. So TCAC has geographic set-asides so that we ensure that we have geographic distribution of credits across the state, including set-asides for rural areas. So next question: can you compare the financing costs or overhead costs for affordable versus market rate housing? A little more on that. Time required to assemble financing for affordable and market rate housing. Regina, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think for this one, it's a little bit more complicated, and we're actually working on assembling data around the cost of affordable housing and really trying to identify which of those costs are unique to affordable housing, unique to it because of, either the needs of the special populations that are served, or unique because of the timing required to assemble all of the various sources of funding. Typically, for market rate housing development, you have debt and equity. Now, of course, there's always a possibility of having sort of like equity from multiple places. But what we see in a typical sources of a sources stack for affordable housing is multiple sources from the state, from the local government, and all of those require a separate application to these different sources of funds. And they also require commitments that might add complexity, and that additional complexity might also add costs. So it's kind of challenging to compare a very simple capital stack that may just have, I went to the bank, they said they'll give this much loan. I went to investor, if I guarantee this amount of return, they'll put in the rest of the money, to all of these different sources that have different application timelines in affordable housing, different requirements that you have to meet, which may affect the design or the operations or some other part of your community that you're building. There's just a lot more complexity there. Matthew, I don't know if you want to add to that in terms of maybe one of the largest identifiers of costs, but I know that it's layered.
Yeah. So a couple of things that we talked about this. It's more complicated because it is public money. It comes with slightly higher labor standards. There are expectations that we're going to be paying people prevailing wages in the area where the labor is working. But a lot of these are shared. The construction costs are shared. As we talked about, sometimes there's a commercial loan that's paying, roughly equivalent of what a private developer would pay. It is very varied. I'm looking at some faces on the screen that are involved in different parts of this. And right now it is taking a long time to line up financing for market rate projects. Now I'm seeing some smiles and head shaking. At the same time, we have affordable projects that when stuff lines up and it moves right from the first financing commitment to breaking ground, we're well under 3 years for a couple of projects, and we're opening within 4 years. So it is very varied. The rough estimate is an affordable unit is about 10% more than a market rate unit, and that's related to those different costs. But that is so varied that average really doesn't represent the kind of complexity of what happens. Our analysis shows if you take out the extra costs of building affordable housing, estimates of them, that we're actually producing affordable housing at a lower cost per unit than we are building market rate housing, just at the pure sort of production level.
That's awesome. Thank you. So I have another kind of quick question, and then we'll get into a little bit more discussion. How can a nonprofit partner with a private investor when nonprofits are not allowed to utilize investors for their build? So it sounds like that's a little bit of a misunderstanding there. So low-income tax credits are a structured and legal way for investors to participate in a nonprofit development. So next question. Eligibility for affordable housing for people coming out of incarceration. So can we talk a little bit about how affordable housing might be tailored to kind of meet the needs of different populations, but maybe especially kind of some of the unique risks for this population in terms of housing instability?
Yeah, some of the challenges with sort of using federal programs that typically would provide rent subsidy, like Section 8, for certain populations, like folks who are coming out of our justice system, is really an impediment, right? Because if you look at the privatization of affordable housing and the fact that there's still a reliance on providing this housing based on revenue received from rents. So either that's coming from the rents that the low income households are able to pay, or that gap could be subsidized or bridged by the Section 8 subsidy, which comes through the through HUD from the federal government. There's still a reliance on that, on like a project being able to have a certain amount of revenue that pays the operating costs, and then maybe even in most cases services a certain amount of debt to be able to make the project feasible. If you have a population that's as vulnerable to having the ability to pay rent, like folks who are coming out of like reentry folks who are coming out of the criminal justice system, and then they don't qualify for the federal Section 8 program because there's limitations around that program being able to service folks who may have felonies and things like that. Then you're not able to fill that gap that you need to have folks who are paying rent. And it really is a challenge. And it's something that, there are nonprofits that are committed to producing housing, reentry housing and reentry programs, but it's not likely to be funded under this structure that produces a high amount of the affordable housing that exists. You typically need dollars that are dedicated to making sure that those properties are viable because of the limitation of being able to use HUD Section 8 dollars for populations that may have a felony and things like that. So this points to some of the limitations of most of, and when I say most of the housing, more than 90% of affordable housing coming through one sort of like framework of how you produce that housing.
Fantastic. Okay, we have another question about how these pieces come together. So specifically, how do you find syndicators? How do you locate all the parts and pieces of this ecosystem that turns tax credits into affordable housing?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are actually both nonprofit and for-profit syndicators. And these are organizations that have this one line of business or primary line of business of identifying affordable housing properties that have tax credits associated with them and looking for investors to match those tax credits with. And so typically there's lots of ways to find them, either through a consultant that might be helping you put together your numbers for your project, or maybe helping you apply to the state for the tax credits, to conferences that these syndicators typically attend, like Housing California. But they also do look to create partnerships with the developers who have the tax credits. So it is public information which projects get awarded tax credits at the state. And so if you're having a hard time finding them, they will find you. But there are a number of CDFIs, lenders, pre-development lenders, who are either also syndicators or partner with syndicators. So if your project is early on and you've been talking to lenders about funding some of your pre-development activity, they also can connect you to syndicators. So there's lots of ways to connect to that syndicator community. And then again, the large banks also do direct investment for tax credits. So if you're talking to a construction lender or a permanent lender, they likely will have the ability to invest in the tax credits or connect you to someone that they do a lot of their deals with.
Thank you so much. Okay, we are approaching the end of our time together, but just kind of last words of wisdom. Matthew, any last words of wisdom, in particular, maybe about some of those final slides you covered?
Yeah, there's always more to say. This has been a tough couple of weeks, I know, for some folks here, and I just want to reiterate that we know what the need is. There's really broad commitment to responding to that need, and it's a question of what is the way forward. And this campaign that we're going to be involved in to November is going to be a tool in that process. As I said, it's not the end all, but we're committed, and I think we all collectively have been committed to knowing we need these resources. And so the two takeaways are: have confidence we can do this together, and two, plug in, because this is a really important route forward that's gonna make those next steps easier and clearer as we start to explore.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to pass it back to Regina to wrap us up.
Yes. And one of the things I want to add is that with the opportunity to identify more local resources, there also is the opportunity to be innovative. And that's one thing that as we better understand how our affordable housing is traditionally created, we can understand ways that we can continue to be innovative and think about what else we need to see in our communities. We look to our members to be in this work with us as thought partners and also supporters of our work. So when you join SB at Home, you allow us to leverage our resources, magnify our voices, and advance strategic collaborative solutions to California's affordable housing crisis that meets our local needs and our regional needs. helping us transform Silicon Valley into the kind of place where all people have access to a safe, stable, and affordable home. So we do ask that you support our work today. Join as a member. We appreciate every size of donation that we receive because it helps us know that you're in this work with us and that we have your support and that we can count on you when we're trying to do these really big things like lower the voter threshold through Prop 5 with you all. So please look at our website. I believe the link is in the chat, and become a member today or renew your membership if you have been a member with us. We appreciate every member and every donation.
Thank you so much. We do have a quick 3-question poll to get your feedback on the event today. We'd appreciate you taking a minute to complete that and let us know how we're doing. We're also looking forward to our next deep dive with you. We'll be reaching back out to everyone that's on this list, as well as our list more broadly. Our next deep dive will be in the first quarter of 2025, and that will be on affordable housing preservation. And yes, thank you. Thanks, Matthew, for recognizing Vince and Jeff have been awesome in the chat, hard at work, answering lots of the questions that have come in too. Right, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today.